Welcome to this episode of Pitching Passion. Today we have Pandora Morris, who has so much to share around all things mental health. Pandora has a background as a lawyer, is a mental health expert, set up Hurt to Healing, a podcast that she founded in 2022, which is a podcast that has inspired people around the areas of mental health, interviewing experts who have shared their own journeys, amazing insights, and has really come from building a place that Pandora, you've wished that has been there for you back in the day. You've got this mission to really help people from all the learnings that you've gone and had. Really exciting podcast to check out with amazing actionable takeaways around the area of mental health. So she's had Ruby Wax, Professor Ian Hickey, Spence Matthews, Joanna Lumley, neuroscientists, and some bloke called James Haskell. No, that's the former England rugby player. What a journey that's brought you on in terms of being able to learn about people. Anything we do in life is such an opportunity to learn about ourselves and the world. Going on this journey, what's it taught you about yourself?
About myself, that I'm not alone. When I started the podcast, I thought that by sharing the intricacies of my mind and what went on for me was going to make me feel like I was this pariah and this freak show. And the more conversations I have, the more that I just realize that the human brain is so fascinating in how it works and how it works so differently in everyone. And we can find crossover and overlap. But ultimately, none of us are ever alone in our struggles. But actually finding the beauty in the pain, as it were, is sometimes and when I'm in a real rut and I think, oh God, I'm frustrated, why does my brain work like this? It's actually sometimes reframing it as, my brain just works in a slightly different way. It doesn't mean that I'm weird. It doesn't mean I'm broken. It doesn't mean that I'm unfixable or this thing that needs to be fixed. But actually it's learning how to manage it and work around it so that it doesn't rule my life, which at times it obviously has. And it's also made me realise the importance of connection, and actually connecting with people is something that for me is just my absolute oxygen on a daily basis.
Well, you're so lucky to have been able to turn the challenges that we will go into that you've had along the way into such an opportunity which has such great purpose. And it's so interesting how you talk around how so reminds you that we all have these things going on, we're all in it together, just this endless tapestry of life that we can learn from. It must surprise you the whole time about the nuggets that you learn from people. This shirt bizarrely says we're not alone, so it's a nice little message of today. You touched on that, how people are different. And it's impossible. I think, in the era of AI, obviously there's so much we have to know about the world. We have no idea what we don't know, right? And that's true in so many different fields. But one field which is so fascinating is what people are going through their mind, like how they operate, how they process information. People respond so differently to different comments. And of course they do, but it's so hard to really see that. Talk to us a bit about that and your learnings around how people are different.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? And as I embark on this whole dating conveyor belt, I realise that everyone brings something different to the party. And I think it's so interesting how in some ways we're all very similar and we all want that sense of purpose. We all want to achieve. We all want to be loved. We all want to feel that sense of connectedness. But some of us have just got a bit lost along the way. And some of us have a much louder inner critic than others. And I'm constantly trying to remind myself, we can't compare ourselves to where someone else is at. I'm at a stage where most of my friends are now married and a lot of them have children. I've been on a very different journey to the majority of them. And it's saying, actually, it's okay not to be on that journey and not to be at the same point as all of them, because we're all unique and we're all different. And I think that sometimes we have to celebrate in our differences, because I think the human race would be unbelievably boring if we were all the same. And as we were talking about before this podcast, life has its ups and its downs. And I think particularly when you work for yourself and you're a business founder and you're always having to motivate yourself and you've got people working with you, but you're ultimately the one that the buck lands with, it can sometimes be really tough. And you sit, and if you're an overthinker, you can sometimes wallow in your overthinking brain and mind. And it's actually, I'm interviewing with a woman next week called Jessamy Hibbard. She's written a book called Overthinking. And she describes this analogy as you're standing on a stage and there's a spotlight, and we can either really focus on all our negative thoughts and a sense of I'm not enough, I'm not doing well, or we can actually change the spotlight into the positive parts of ourselves, which we all have, but we tend not to focus on because of the negativity bias that happens in the brain, right? We always focus on what's not going well, what we haven't achieved, because ultimately that's been a survival strategy for years. That's how man has survived. And so as an evolutionary sort of tactic, the brain will always go to the negative before it goes to the positive. And it's actually learning to reframe that and be like, what's going right? What am I good at? What do people tell me and give me positive feedback for? And I think one of my main learnings this year is about how we deal with that sense of doubt, because ultimately, which I'm sure we'll come on to talk about, with OCD, when you struggle with OCD, you are crippled by doubt, and at times it can become so paralyzing. And I think one of the main things that I've really discovered is sometimes you need people around you to cheerlead you on and to believe in you before you can believe in yourself. And you do need that buffer of people. And I've been very lucky in finding some of those individuals, and I'm very, very grateful.
Yeah, so many amazing pieces there. And Pandora, what's so clear as someone who sits next to you is just how much you have to give to the world through your endless conversations you've had through people, your passion, and also the tough parts. Let's face it, you speak to a grounded entrepreneur, whoever it is, anyone who's pursued anything, and their learning so much have come through the times where things haven't gone well as the successes, right? And it's interesting how we do struggle as a society to be vulnerable with each other because it's just not the natural preset. But sometimes when one meets particularly level successful people, they are very clever and open about that in a very collaborative way. And so interesting you talk around that concept, because the world doesn't have this weird concept where you can feel you're on your own island, right? And there's very quick ways to make that gap between you and people dissolve. But everyone has got things on their plate, right? And people have so much to worry about for their own things, so they're not really concerned about what's going on in your world. What traits have you seen from people that you really rate and look up to?
Whenever I'm with someone who has that deep level of empathy, I'm struck by just how much more connected one can feel to them. And I think sometimes people get so caught up in the pace at which life moves now, particularly with phones and AI, and everyone's onto the next thing, onto the next thing, onto the next thing. And I think when someone pauses and stops and really takes the time to be present with you, for me, that fosters such a deep connection, but also that feeling of really truly seeing the other person. And I think sometimes as people, we don't see other people for really who they are and what they are, because ultimately we are all wearing masks a lot of the time because we want to project a certain image. We want to appear to be confident when in fact inside we're spiraling into that sense of shame or judgment. Even I met a guy in the gym and I'm there thinking, oh my God, he thinks I'm a weirdo. He thinks I'm like pushing myself in the gym. Here I am. Oh God, look, my gym outfit's not good enough. I'm looking at all the other women, comparing myself to them. And ultimately, it's also that sense of self-assuredness and that self-confidence in just being you. I really try and show up as myself as an authentic way as I possibly can. And when I see that in someone else, I really admire it, because I once had a friend who said, I love you for you. I don't really care about some of your quirkier behaviours or habits, because ultimately it's the essence of you. And sometimes it's reminding people that you're there because you treasure them and you really value them as a person. We can get so caught up into thinking, oh my God, I need to project this or that. And people who make you feel safe and confident enough to do that are just real diamonds in the rubble, as it were.
Sometimes having a purpose can have huge impact in terms of our ability to impact things, whether it be in a role, a company, or a family, a partner. What are the things you've seen that can really help people dial up in terms of being able to contribute?
You need to discover what that purpose is. By and large, I used to be on the spin bike in the gym, and I still do this, thinking, oh my God. I would be listening to a podcast, whether it be Stephen Bartlett or Chris Williamson or Mel Robbins, and they'd be like, the only time you change is when the pain of staying the same starts to outweigh the pain of actually stepping into the new you and the new version of yourself and taking the plunge into the unknown, which we all find unbelievably daunting. And I think sometimes to find that purpose, you need to tap into that pain. And sometimes if you talk to many founders and individuals who have really struggled, they'll turn that struggle and that suffering into something great. And It's funny, Chris Williamson actually said this the other day. He was like, the thing that causes you the most pain in life will be the thing that you're most admired for on the outside. And time again, I just observe it in other people. And it's so true, because often, like, internally we'll be berating ourselves for something that being overly perfectionistic, being too beholden to a routine, you're not putting ourselves out there enough. And other people will be like, God, they're so disciplined, they're so motivated. I wish I had more of that. I wish I had that ability to be completely rigid about what I do and how I do it, and controlled about X, Y, and Z. And ultimately, I think it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because we all often want what other people have, and we search for that in so many different ways. But igniting that sense of purpose for me, has come from that place of suffering, and what could I actually give to the world, what I wish I had when I was growing up, as you said.
Have there been moments recently where you've been in a conversation, or it's like an old friend that you have, and you've seen something in them where you're like, I've just seen, maybe it's a behaviour, a comment, or their approach to something that you're like, I rate that something that needs to be emulated more?
Yeah, for example, in our conversation earlier with you, your ability to just say, I'm going off to New York and I'm just going to see what happens. Or I just went off and I took myself alone to Greece and I went kite surfing for a week. I admire spontaneity in people and the ability to just go in with not really much expectation, but just putting themselves out there. And I'm trying to do that in a way for myself that I find palatable and manageable. But I love the fact that people just can be so free, because that's the thing quite often when you have something like OCD, which really keeps you in this mental, sort of an internal cage, as it were, because you have to do X, Y, and Z, because you feel like if you don't, then the whole world's going to implode. And obviously I'm beyond I know that's not the case, but it still keeps me slightly in its shackles to a degree. And I hope in 5 years' time I will just be like, if someone says let's go to Greece next week, it's just like, yeah, great. What I'm learning is that actually, if I feel safe enough with the person and they say let's do this, I can actually now say, okay, yeah, let's do it.
I don't know if you relate to this analogy, but it's one that I'm slightly kind of feel linked to. You've got the whole analogy which we always hear, which is like you just keep on going. Great people push that, and things do take time. Slightly like people who, attention spans, expectations, our horizon that we look into, be it sometimes our mission or our goal or things we want, it can just be quite short-term thinking sometimes, and maybe that is a big product of our environment. But do you feel part of life is like riding a bike, keep on going, but almost not holding the handlebars too tightly, letting things go? Because when you start to force things, and that pressure of performing every day in a certain way, we're not machines, and you do have to slightly go with the flow a bit. Does that relate to you? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I like that analogy. I think when you hold on too tightly, suddenly the colour really saps out of life very quickly, because you become so rigid and you don't see the offerings that the universe has. Often now, I say to myself, you know what, the universe will just give you a sign. There's a decision that I'm wrestling with, and I'm just going to wait for that sign. And someone might send a message, someone might say something that just sparks that idea. I might, it's just these quirky little things that happen. And I think if you're holding onto those bicycle handles too tightly, you fail to see them. For so long I had my head down. I was just in this absolute straitjacket. And if I didn't do what I needed to do in a day, it was an absolute disaster. Whereas you really notice that actually when you start to just loosen the grip a bit, the excitement comes back into life, and suddenly, 90% of the time you might like to be beholden to a bit more of a routine and a structure and be on that bike holding the handlebars, but then the other 10% of the time it's just so amazingly liberating to just let go of the handlebars and see what happens. And it's scary, but the more you do it, the more you start to realise, okay, that's okay, because 90% of the time I can still do what makes me feel safe and what anchors me. And then the other 10%, I can just see where it goes. And some people have the ability to hold on to the handlebars 50% of the time and to just let go 50% of the time. It's different for everyone, and you have to know yourself. And particularly with age, there's this old thing, youth is wasted on the young. Particularly with women, it's often that thing of, there's this idea in society anyway that as you get older and you age, women freak out that they're becoming less attractive. But actually, you grow so much in wisdom and self-confidence because you start to know yourself a lot better. And I'm definitely experiencing that slight shift of actually really enjoying getting to know myself and actually who I am and what makes me tick.
So beautiful, that. It's really nice. So, Pandora, you've reached millions of people in a subject that is tender. It's a subject with mental health. There's so many shades and that fits in people's life in such different ways. What are the moments that have been clear for you where you've helped people? And this isn't time to be British. What you're doing serves as such an amazing example of how we can be there for others. And actually, we need to be. We're designed as people to be there for each other. You look at anything that's been built of a huge value, it's people have had each other's backs to help make that happen. It only and always will be a team effort. But please share, because it is moving and amazing what you do and how you are changing people's lives, whether it be making them actually get out of bed within those 3 minutes or viewing something differently. There'll be countless examples, comments and moments that it will have hit you. Please, can you share that?
I love the very un-British side of it. Yeah, of the question. Yeah, I remember one of my first friends actually, and she wasn't a really close friend at the time, and she said, just thank you so much for helping me understand the way that my mind works, because I never really realised what was going on, and actually in you sharing it, it's giving me the courage and the confidence to realise that maybe I'm not so broken, and I'm not such an outcast, and the way my mind works isn't just so abnormal and weird. Because I think this is a lot of the comments and feedback I get from people is just thank you for making me feel less alone. Because I think when you have all these intrusive thoughts, and particularly when you're spiralling alone, and let's be honest, anyone with a mental health struggle tends to hibernate, and they tend to retreat into themselves, and that sense of feeling connected really dissolves very quickly. And in trying to create a bit of a community and in making people feel less alone, that gives me huge comfort. And a lot of parents actually who will often say, I never really understood the way that Emily's mind worked, and you've just given me so much clarity, and thank you, because we've been at loggerheads for years and we couldn't stop arguing because I just couldn't understand why she was behaving in the way she did, why she couldn't express what was going on. And you've really given me that clarity. And talking to girls, particularly ones with eating disorders, who say, I remember one of the first ones that came up to me and she recognised my voice, and it was quite a weird moment. And she said, you're not the host of the Hurt to Healing podcast, are you? And I said, yeah, I am. And she said, God, you really got me through treatment, and I've just come out, and your podcast was just the most amazing thing to listen to, because it was so inspiring having someone who was a bit further on and knowing that this wasn't it forever. Because I think so often, particularly with pretty chronic mental health issues, you feel that this is just how it's going to be, and this is just where you've got to sit. And I think in life, this is a lesson that I'm constantly reminding myself of too. We're never the same person. We don't stay the same. You can reach these plateaus and you can stay there for a while, but we're always evolving. We're always works in progress. And having other people to look to as those, whether they're, I don't want to say idols, but just barometers of change and evidence that people do change and people do evolve.
And we talked about it earlier, this analogy of the spotlight and how there's always going to be different things happening, and two things can be true. When I interviewed on the podcast, talked about this thing of conflict and how we can be conflicted about wanting two things. And I think reality with many things about the world is different things can be true at the same time, right? And you do need to channel one's narrative to be like, wow, I am this because these things are true, and just slightly try and leave the fear behind. And guess what? The most successful people have also had those really horrible messages that are coming from yourself. So it's interesting how people are connected in having these different narratives. So on the opposite of this end from fear is this deeply empathetic, supportive, loving character that is somewhere in us all, which we need to use and embed ourselves with love. For listeners listening, maybe they're driving, they're like, oh, leave us alone, I don't want any of this today. But actually, maybe there'll be a moment where they do want to hear this. Are there 2 or 3 messages that have been impactful to you?
I love the Oscar Wilde quote, be yourself because everyone else is taken. Sometimes we want to fit into a mould, and we want to prove to people around us and prove to ourselves that we can do really hard things, and that we can become this person that maybe comes from an inner child place and comes from a protector or a vulnerable part of ourselves. And I sometimes think actually just try and tap into what am I actually good at, but what also suits me and my lifestyle. Because I was interviewing this great mental health advocate called Ellie Middleton. She has pretty severe autism. She's about to start writing her third book in the space of something extraordinary like a year and a half. And we were talking about careers, and I said, oh gosh, do you ever feel like, what if I pursued this career path? What if I pursued that career path? And she said, yeah, it's something I really wrestled with because I always wanted to be a Blue Peter presenter. But it's only recently that I've sat down and said to myself, but Ellie, think of you as a person and how compatible that would be with the way that your mind works. It would mean commuting on a train where people with autism really struggle with loud noises and changes of routine, and it would mean someone, you know, in your ear while you're doing an interview, so talking to you at the same time. It would mean like constant levels of uncertainty, and actually that is not who you are. And I think sometimes our goals and aspirations don't necessarily feed into who we are as people. And we forget the person that's pursuing those goals and aspirations. And yeah, there's part of me that would really love to be running my own radio show and a TV presenter and writing books and hosting the podcast still and hosting live events for the community. But ultimately there is only one of me, and I also have to look after myself. And so it's just sometimes sitting back, and then I get these moments where I'm like, oh my God, maybe I should have gone into finance. Maybe I should have pursued my career as a lawyer. And you're like, no, I wasn't that corporate animal. I tried that and that wasn't for me. So like, shut that down. But it's also tapping into that jealousy sometimes that we feel towards people who are doing stuff that we're like, actually, I really want to do that. And that's what spurred me on to start the podcast, is because I had a couple of friends who had podcasts, and I was like, you know what? I really want to do that. And it's when you get that itch, because you really know that you want to be doing something, and you know that you potentially could do something that someone else is doing. And I think it's separating out that from those unrealistic goals and expectations. So that's something I would say. And then I think also, you knowing what down regulates you and what actually gives you that inner sense of calm and safety, because I think a lot of us, again, we get so caught up on that treadmill and feeling that need to achieve, feeling that need to just go, and we get on this hamster wheel, and then suddenly you're like, God, I'm frazzled. I've reached that point of complete burnout. And really getting those anchors in your day on a daily basis that really just let you just calm, sit. And that might just be I love having dinner by myself and reading. And sometimes it's being able to say to people, I am free tonight, but actually I'm not free because I'm having dinner by myself and I need that to read and have a bath and go to bed early. And I think having the courage and the confidence to do that says a lot about a person.
What are some of the practices that you really rate that maybe hobby-based or a daily ritual that gives more than it sounds?
Definitely, I find having dinner alone, having an early dinner at home, being able to read. I have the guilty pleasure of magazines. I love sitting down, having a dinner with a magazine, not having a deadline, and just being able to just feel very calm. I love having a good box set on the go, something that's sort of, a bit of escapism. And that definitely just helps me not get too consumed by my thoughts. Always having a bath before bed. That's my absolute, whatever time it is, wherever I've been, I always have a bath, because it just, for me, before bed, I read in the bath and it just lets me have that pause before bed. And the old adage now spoken about, but just not looking at my phone an hour before bed, because I know, and sometimes I'm bad and I do, and I'm like tempted, but then I have a crap night's sleep. But I really just try and put my phone on the side before my bath, and that's it. No more phone, have the bath, read a bit more in bed, and consistency of trying to wake up and go to bed at the same time within obviously like an hour. But that for me really helps.
You talked about the universe earlier. Tell us about that.
The universe has this extraordinary way of giving you what you need when you need it, and keep teaching you the same lesson until you decide to learn from that lesson. I have experienced this time and time again, and continue to experience it on I know a lot of the areas where the universe will keep teaching me the same lesson until I decide to really change my behaviours once and for all. And it can nudge you in the direction, but it will still keep throwing things in your path until you fully actually decide to drop the rope, as it were. And I also think the universe has an extraordinary way of just giving you signs about what you're meant to be doing and when. And if you really tap into that, weird things will happen. people will invite you to something, or someone will, as I said before, someone will send you a message, or just something will be cancelled, which then opens up an avenue for you to be like, okay, I'm actually going to go to that other thing that I was invited to, or a speaking event will come up and someone will then invite you to stay where the speaking event's happening. So it's, that it's meant to be. And it's so beautiful when it works. It constantly amazes me. And the synchronicity of how those energy fields work is unexplainable, but it's beautiful at the same time.
There are some words that are so simple, but not necessarily used that much. One is trust in things working out. You could call it trust in the universe, or trust in where we're meant to be. Sometimes people who are more geared towards listening to the universe do say, or this sort of ilk of thinking, I need to quite literally look out for signs. What am I feeling? What am I seeing? Do you relate to that?
Yeah, on a daily basis, Arthur. I think it's extraordinary how it works. Constantly things just seem to happen. It might be, again, like I said, it might be a friend ringing up and say, oh, do you want to go to the pub tonight? And you go to the pub and you sit down and suddenly a guy sits next to you and you get chatting and you exchange numbers and you go on a date the next week. Maybe it's as small as that. The other day I had this really weird incident in the gym where a guy was wearing a cap with the name of one of my dad's really old friends on it. And I was like, that's a sign from the universe. I need to go up to that guy and start a conversation. But you never know I don't know where that's going to lead. It's still an open box. But sometimes I think it's just having the confidence to pursue those lines. And the way the universe works is it is extraordinary.
Have there been moments where you've met someone who's just got such an extraordinary sense of trust in the world and their world's working out? Because I find that's always quite unusual when you meet people who are so unstressed and they just have conviction that things work out. What do you think we can take away from maybe some of those people that you've come across?
I think usually it's those people that have been on a pretty tumultuous, horrendous journey themselves up to that point where they've been able to really work on themselves and come to that inner sense of peace. I don't think anyone's just like that. I don't believe that you can have that absolute trust unless you've really sat with that lack of trust for a while and the desire to hold on to control and realise that actually living a life like that isn't very pleasant and it really takes us further and further away from who we are. And I'm wrestling with that at the moment. I know that certain behaviours don't serve me anymore, but they're still coming from a protectorate part of myself that I understand, and it's all fear-based. And I'm not quite ready to drop them yet, but I can see how they're holding me back still. And I think when someone's been on that journey and has uncovered everything in themselves, I interviewed Gabor Mate and he said, what does recovery mean? And I sat there and I was like, it's all about uncovering who you are as a person. And I think some of us get so removed from actually who we are and reconnecting with that. Life it all goes in cycles, doesn't it? Sometimes you have to face all these horrible things and adversities to come to a point of realization that actually things don't always work out, but having that inner sense of self and peace is something that really helps you navigate those hard moments when things don't work out in your favour and when things are going wrong, because nothing will ever go right for everyone and anyone all the time.
We're going to talk about a word. We're going to talk about the F word, fear. You've gone on an amazing journey of learning about so many topics, some of which we've discussed. Can you give us a really simple analogy of how fear should be managed well?
Fear is something that is completely paralysing at times. But what I would say is when you're facing a fear, you've got to ask yourself, where's that fear coming from? Because a lot of the time we wear this armour to protect ourselves from the fear. Whereas in fact, if we took the armour off, we'd realise that actually the fear is not something to actually be so fearful of. And Brené Brown talks a lot about fear and doubt. And in order to face fear, we do have to be vulnerable. We do have to be emotionally exposed. And we do have to have that sense of the outcome might be, it is uncertain. There is no certainty in any outcome. But facing the fear and doing it anyway will lead to a renewed sense of confidence. A really helpful tactic can be reframing fear as excitement. And actually, every time you feel so fearful about something, it's actually, maybe I'm excited about it, because the brain doesn't know the difference between fear and excitement. It lights up the same region. So actually, if you can say to yourself, actually, I'm really excited about this, suddenly the fear starts to dissipate. And as well, when you're facing something that really challenges you, for me, It's reminding myself of those little affirmations. I'm safe, I'm lovable, I'm okay. Whatever works for you. I'm not a massive proponent of looking at yourself in the mirror and telling you things that you really don't believe, but just that thing of my feet are on the ground and I'm safe and I can do hard things. And the more that you start to get that evidence and face the fears, and I think sometimes you need to do it on a gradual, graded process, because if you start to do the thing that fills you with the most fear, then you're probably going to procrastinate and you won't do it. But if you start off with those little tasks that actually, you know what, I can push through that, and you do them and you give your brain the evidence that it's safe, I'm okay. Because ultimately it all boils down to the story you're telling yourself. Like, why are you scared of that thing? It's because I've told myself I'm scared of it. And we all fear change. Humans just fear change as a threat. And again, that goes back to evolutionary principles where change is essentially a threat for the brain. But if we get stuck in such a rut, you so soon start to just feel, again, like we said before, that feeling of not moving forward, of just that stuckness, that, ugh, God, and not a nice feeling. And it stops us from really realising our potential. And it becomes the enemy of growth, and it becomes the enemy of joy.
You know those little moments that lift your day? A smile, the sun coming out, or a piece of chocolate? Audrey's Chocolates have been handcrafting chocolate for over 70 years. Chocolate to die for. It comes in beautiful boxes that make for the perfect gift. Or bars of chocolate that feed daily joy. Discover your moment of joy by visiting audreyschocolates.co.uk and treat yourself to 10% off using the code TheCollective10.
You've had over 300 or so interviews. Can you give us some highlight examples of things you've learned or heard that just hit you hard and be like, wow, that's interesting, or that makes sense and that's super smart?
Oh my God, Arthur.
Not an easy question.
That is not an easy question. Just in having so many deep conversations with people, it's that no one escapes suffering in their life, really. People can run away from it and people can be in denial. But ultimately, what these conversations all show me is that there is a struggle and a suffering, sadly, that everyone encounters at any given stage in their life. Gosh, I don't even know where to begin. So Professor David Nutt, who's one of the main psychedelic researchers in the world now, he really opened my eyes to psilocybin and ketamine-assisted psychotherapy and all the other options that are out there, which I'm a big proponent of. And I've had a few conversations with various doctors about psychedelics on the podcast, because I think that's really where a lot of mental health's going. Another actually psychiatrist called Dr. Mark Horowitz, who talked to me about titrating off SSRIs and other sort of anti-anxiety medications, and that was really life-changing for me, because I was prescribed one medication when I was 12, and it's now very heavily monitored, and it's a very controlled drug because it's so highly addictive. And if I had known that when I was 12, I'm now trying to titrate off it once and for all, but the process has been brutal, and he really opened my eyes to how we actually often think that these withdrawal symptoms are actually us relapsing, when in fact it's just withdrawal. So you have to do it so unbelievably slowly when you're trying to titrate off those medications. That personally was really powerful for me. And then just hearing these personal journeys, even like you said about James Haskell, knowing that someone who on the outside appeared to be this big boisterous rugby player who wouldn't let anyone stand in his way, was crippled by lack of self-confidence and would replay matches time and time again, berate himself for not being good enough, and actually understanding that he was someone who really struggled with ADHD, and that he liked to be like super busy doing sort of 10 different things at a time. But it's just this tapestry of the human race is just extraordinary. And sometimes some of the most interesting interviews I have are people with similar stories. I did Dr. Alex George, and he'd only recently been diagnosed with OCD, having primarily thought that his issue was ADHD, and having such a deep connection. And I love those OCD interviews because I think OCD is such a misunderstood condition. So another one was with Kimberly Nixon, another one was with Bryony Gordon. And they bring me so much depth, those OCD conversations, because there's just this synergy and this appreciation for what each other's sort of journeys have looked like. And then obviously the privilege of interviewing someone like Gabor Mate, which is just immense. It's so funny because when you say Gabor Mate, some people are like, who? And then other people are like, oh my God, Gabor Mate. So, it's different for everyone, but every interview gives me something unique. And one of my favourite interviews I did recently was with Emma Louise Boynton. And it's so weird how these things happen at a stage where I don't know, it coincides with what you're going through. And she's written a book called Pleasure, which is all about anorexia and sex and reconnecting with her body and how she realised that she had never really got any pleasure from sex apart from in one relationship in her early 20s. And so in her late 20s, she went on this journey to reconnect with her body and has written this extraordinary book all about that. And that was a really great conversation because, again, it's something that I've experienced and I think so many women experience but don't talk about enough.
Let's jump into OCD. What is OCD?
OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, is a very complex condition, but essentially it's basically the sufferer is bombarded with intrusive thoughts. And in order to deal with those intrusive thoughts, you feel the need to carry out a compulsion, so a behaviour, and that behaviour might be tapping something a particular number of times, it might be checking something, it might be imagining a sequence of people in your head, but essentially the compulsion is there to negate the obsessive intrusive thought becoming a reality. And the thing with OCD is that it metastasizes very quickly because it will attach to the thing that you care about the most in life. So it might be about being a perfect person, it might be about not causing harm to anyone else, it might be about not being contaminated by AIDS. And you will do anything in your power to prevent that outcome becoming a reality. And so the disorder creates this, in a form of magical thinking, all these rituals you have to do to get that certainty that the outcome won't come true. But the trouble is, obviously you can do any amount of things, and as a rational brain will realise is that anything can happen at any time. You can't guarantee that by tapping say for 100 times that dad's not going to die. And it becomes so paralysing so quickly because the sufferer just goes into that state of fight, flight or freeze, and the amygdala becomes so activated that you're just literally living hell basically inside your head.
You talked in the past about your mother went to a local doctor and was like, I think my daughter's got OCD, what do I do? And they were like, what's OCD? That was not yesterday, as it were, and OCD is talked about in a different way now than then, but what about OCD do you want to share and want people to be more aware of?
First of all, that OCD is not seeing one of those people who can't step on 3 drains on the pavement, or who has to check the lock 5 times when they leave the house, or who has to organise their socks in a particular way in their drawer. OCD is something that really starts to take over someone's life and really consumes the sufferer with this level of doubt and anxiety that people who haven't had OCD will just not be able to comprehend. And it becomes a living nightmare because it will become your sole purpose. And it gets to the point quite often when people can't leave rooms of houses because there are so many compulsions and rituals they have to do either in order to leave that room, or once they get out of the room, there are just so many different variables that can happen that will disrupt the sort of OCD's semblance of control.
We're not going to dive immensely in your journey, but for those that are interested, the way you connect to your historic experiences with OCD and your mental health journey, there's no two ways about it. You really share in a way that people can understand, take learnings from, and also maybe it's fair to say that when you see people suffer from something, there's often one might not have experienced that specific experience, but those feelings from that challenge one can relate to, and it's very extraordinary the way you do share it. What are the topics that you want to really devote time to that you don't think you've done yet enough?
One of the really interesting things that I'm really sitting with at the moment is that I'm not sure I agree with all these labels we're putting on ourselves, because I think what is neurodivergence and what is being neurotypical? And this is something I think we're all on a spectrum, right? And from interviewing the number of people I have, I realise that yeah, there are parts of me that relate massively to someone who's autistic. There are parts of me that relate massively to someone with ADHD. I obviously was originally diagnosed with OCD and anorexia. At times I've lapsed into binge eating. At times I've lapsed into purging. At times my overexercise could be, it's an addiction, but is it also purging? So something I really want to start having a conversation about, which some psychiatrists are definitely starting to talk about, is the fact that are these labels actually as helpful as we think they are? Because the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is basically what psychiatrists will refer to when they're diagnosing someone, it's just getting bigger and bigger, because the number of symptoms, the number of diagnoses now is just expanding so rapidly. And the problem that we're facing now is that so many people are being diagnosed that actually the people who really need the help and the resources are not getting them. Quite often there's this whole notion now of another person with ADHD, and it's slightly met with an eye roll. So I'd like to explore that a bit more and go down the neuroscience route, because I think the way our brains work is much more helpful, certainly for me, in understanding the idiosyncrasies of how my brain works and why it works in a particular way. Why, with something like rejection sensitive dysphoria, you always interpret something as a negative, or it's always about you. And that for me is starting to be much more helpful. And another thing I really want to do more of is the whole AI and dating landscape, and what is going on there with phones and apps, and what it's actually doing to our brains and our mental health in a big way. We're only scratching the surface, I think, of actually the negative implications of how addicted we are to our devices and phones and social media. There's a lot of scope there for more work to be done, because I think it is really dysregulating our nervous systems and really reducing our brain capacity and power, and really taking us away from the joys in life, like playing and human connectedness and all of those things that we really need just to thrive and survive.
Looking at you, it sounds like you've got a lot to be getting along with. Pandora.
I hope so, Arthur. I hope that I've got lots more interesting topics to dive into, because I'm in it for the long haul.
You are. It's been our treat today to have you share all that you've shared. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this, hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. Want to support the podcast, inspire as many people as possible? You can either make a donation on the Buy Me a Coffee link in our bio and website. Want to access exclusive content? Submit ideas for future episodes? Join below as a Patreon member, and we will make you feel special. Thanks so much for listening.